I'm your host, Lauren Conlin, and welcome to the Outlier Podcast. Today, we're going to be covering some ongoing developments in the Bryan Kohberger trial. And Bryan Kohberger is the man accused of committing the shocking and tragic murders of 4 University of Idaho students in 2022. But on today's episode, I also have a special interview with Howard Blum. And Howard Blum is a former investigative reporter for the New York Times and author of the book When the Night Comes Falling, a requiem for the Idaho student murders. So that is very exciting. But before we get to my interview with Howard Blum, I do want to give you a quick rundown of this case and some major updates following Bryan Kohberger's first court appearance since the trial was moved to a new county in September of 2024. We're going to get into why the case was relocated and what happened in the last hearing and what's next for the trial. But before we start, just a trigger warning. Today's episode will discuss violent crimes, including murder, so please take care while listening. So let's rewind just a bit. The 29-year-old suspect, Bryan Kohberger, is accused of killing 4 University of Idaho students back in November of 2022 in an incredibly brutal manner. These students, Kaylee Goncalves, Madison Mogan, Xana Kernodle, and Ethan Chapin, were brutally stabbed in an off-campus home in Moscow, Idaho, and this case has captured national attention ever since. And initially, the trial was set to take place in Latah County, Idaho, where the murders happened. But Kohberger's defense team argued that holding the trial there could lead to an unfair trial, mainly because they believed that there was this mob mentality surrounding the case in that area. So they claimed potential jurors in Latah County would be way too biased due to the intense media coverage and local public opinion and speculation. And the defense arguments were successful. So the trial has now been moved over 300 miles away to Ada County in Boise, Idaho. And the aim here is to give Bryan Kohberger a better chance at a fair trial. But this move has definitely created some new challenges that I will go over. So let's talk about his latest appearance, Bryan Kohberger's appearance at Ada County Court on September 26th. And this was the first time he appeared in court since the relocation, and it brought quite a few significant developments. So he dressed in a suit and tie, Bryan Kohberger, not a prison jumpsuit, and he was handcuffed as he made his way into the courtroom. And this was actually the first time that he wore handcuffs in court, and his defense team successfully petitioned for him to wear, quote, street clothes instead of prison attire, and they argued that was a way to reduce potential bias from the jury. So they pointed to a 1976 Supreme Court decision that ruled forcing a defendant to wear a jail uniform could unfairly influence how the jury perceives them. And I understand that. As much as I really don't like Bryan Kohberger, I do get that. And his public defender, Ann Taylor, she is doing a pretty good job so far. She filed this request and it was granted for this hearing, or the hearing on September 26th, but the judge has yet to decide whether Kohberger will be allowed to wear non-prison clothes in future hearings and for the trial itself. So, as you can imagine, not everyone was happy about that decision. The family of Kaylee Goncalves, who was one of the victims, her dad has been very vocal in speaking out, and her family in general, and I truly don't blame them. I cannot imagine what they have been going through, but they expressed immense frustration that Kohberger would be allowed to appear in court in anything other than prison garb. And it brings up a lot of emotions for them. They've lost their precious daughter. And Howard Blum gets into some things that Kaylee's father says, and it's heartbreaking. So let's get to the most significant development in the last hearing. And this came from the newly assigned judge, Judge Stephen Hippler. He raised some concerns about the timeline of the trial, which is expected to last 3 to 4 months. And with the case now set to be tried in Boise, Hippler pointed out that the original trial date, which was scheduled for summer of 2025, could create issues for jurors, given that the trial could span an entire summer vacation. Hippler suggested that this might be a logistical problem, making it harder for jurors to fully commit. So, what are the options? Hippler floated around the idea of starting the trial in either May or delaying it until September. And of course, prosecutors were in favor of starting in May, just likely wanting to push forward with the case as soon as possible, because that's generally how it goes. But Kohberger's defense team requested that the trial be pushed back to September. So both sides were asked to present their arguments in a closed hearing, and then the judge will make a final decision on when the trial will officially begin. So we should know soon. But I'm sure that the families of the victims are just done. They just want to move on with their lives. So I'm sure they're like, let's not postpone this anymore. But the delay in the timeline does bring up a lot of questions on how the case will unfold and whether these logistics will create more delays down the line, because asking a jury to spend their entire summer inside a courtroom, I feel like that is a big ask. But before I play my interview with Howard, I want to take a moment to recap the charges that Bryan Kohberger is facing and some of the details of the crime that shocked the nation. In November of 2022, Bryan Kohberger allegedly broke into the off-campus home where 4 Idaho students lived. Kaylee Goncalves, Madison Mogan, Xana Kernodle, and Xana's boyfriend, Ethan Chapin, were all present and staying in the home that night. And tragically, all 4 were found to be stabbed to death in the home, but 2 other roommates were also in the house and were unharmed and have been key witnesses in this investigation. And you will hear Howard depict what he believes happened that night in the home based on evidence and what these witnesses have disclosed so far. And it is both tragic but also fascinating. So Bryan Kohberger was arrested about 6 weeks later and charged with these murders. And when he appeared in court back in 2023, Bryan Kohberger chose to remain silent when asked to enter a plea, leading the judge to enter a not guilty plea on his behalf. And prosecutors have since announced that if he is convicted, they will seek the death penalty. So what happens next? So right now, as I mentioned, we're waiting for the judge's decision on the official trial start date, whether it'll be in May or September of 2025. And again, there are ongoing debates about whether or not Bryan Kohberger will be allowed to wear street clothes or be required to wear prison attire in future appearances. And of course, as we get closer to the trial, hopefully, we're likely to hear more about the evidence and the defense's strategy in attempting to defend Bryan Kohberger against these charges. And what's clear to me anyway is that this case isn't just about determining Bryan Kohberger's guilt or innocence. It's going to raise larger questions about the legal process, potential jury biases, and the death penalty. And I think that Kaylee's family being so outspoken and the fact that this has taken forever and that there is some doubt in this case, although most of us, and again, this is my opinion, really do believe that Bryan Kohberger is the guy that committed these heinous acts. Everything points to him, in my opinion, but there isn't a murder weapon, and his legal team seems to be doing a good job in poking holes in certain evidence that the prosecution has brought forth. So I really hope that the state does continue to bring their A game. But let's get to Howard Blum. Blum, who is a 2-time Pulitzer-nominated author and is actually celebrating 50 years as a best-selling investigative journalist and crime reporter, having covered this case from its start, Howard has literally become the almost go-to authority on the case. He knows so much about it, and again, speaking with him was truly fascinating. So without further ado, here is my interview with Howard Blum. Hello, Howard. How are you?
Fine. Nice to speak with you.
Yes, thank you so much for joining me. I really appreciate it. And I actually just purchased your book and I just started it. So I'm very excited.
I won't give away the ending then. No.
Well, I mean, I have to say, I'm also following the case very closely. But I first, Howard, want to start with you because you've just had this amazingly impressive career as an investigative journalist and an author. And I'm dying to know what drew you to investigative journalism in the first place.
I like solving puzzles. I like mysteries. And when I got out of college, I first started at the Village Voice. And then after being there for a couple of years, I was hired by the New York Times. And as soon as I got to the New York Times, they threw me into the Son of Sam case about a murderer who was going around New York and shooting people at close blank range in lovers lanes around the city. And that was my first big crime story, and I've been following others since then.
Wow. Howard, I want to also ask you from when you started, and clearly you started on a very high profile case, the Son of Sam, but as you got more experienced in your career, how has your approach to these cases evolved or changed over the years?
Well, it's a good question. What I've tried to do as I get older is not just make this a police procedural study about how the case is cracked, but also a study of the people involved. And that's what I tried to do in When the Night Comes Falling. And again, it's called a requiem, the subtitle for the Idaho student murders, because I wanted to give portraits of the students whose lives were lost. But I also write about the parents of the suspect who are trying to come to terms with the fact that their son is a monster and or might very well be a monster. And the father takes a cross-country trip with his son. And in the course of this trip, while they're being covertly followed by the FBI, the father comes to the realization that, oh my gosh, my son might be guilty, and yet he can't quite cross that emotional Rubicon. And on the other side of the spectrum, there's the father of one of the survivors, Kaylee Goncalves. This father refuses to accept events. He wants to stand up to the police, to everything that is happening. He wants to make sure that even though his daughter is gone, he wants to honor her memory by making sure that there is justice and also a measure of vengeance to this case. He's advocating a firing squad, which a law has been passed in Idaho. If the suspect is convicted, that a firing squad is a possibility for execution. This father has been vehement in talking about the case and keeping it in the public's eye. And that, to me, is a profile in courage. It's also a profile of a man who's become another victim, too, unfortunately.
Yeah, I think about Kaylee's father a lot because he has been so vocal. And from the outside, it does seem like he is a bit frustrated with the prosecution and with the fact that this whole process has taken so long. But I think many of us who are not in his shoes, and that's not our child's, I guess we can step back and appreciate the fact that the state wants a conviction and they don't want to do this again, I'm assuming. And they are going through everything with a fine-tooth comb here. And I feel like there needs to be some kind of major revelation, I think, before the trial begins, or some kind of strategy that's revealed by the state. Because in my opinion, Howard, everything does point to Bryan Kohberger. I just feel like there are some holes. And I don't know if you agree with that. And I guess I just mean legally in the courtroom. Looking back, I think he did it. I do. I know he's innocent until proven guilty, but I just, do you know what I'm saying? I feel like there are some holes.
Yes, very, very much so. I think you've summed it up very well. I think I believe, too, that Kohberger is the murderer. You can just look at his alibi. He's had, nearly 2 years to come up with an alibi, and all he said is that he was off at 4 o'clock in the morning on the night the murders occurred in a wilderness park on a freezing night, staring at the stars,
Yeah.
and there are no witnesses to this.
Right.
That's the best he could come up with. At the same time, as you point out, the evidence against him is in many ways circumstantial. They have cell phone evidence, for example, that puts his phone in the area where the murders occurred. And that's key, puts him in the area where the murders occurred. It's a 13-mile radius. 13 miles is a large distance, especially in a small town like Moscow. Yeah. You have DNA evidence, but this is blood. This is not blood DNA, but it's touch DNA, and that's a bit more problematic. And they're going to have experts that will go into the courtroom on both sides, and they will argue for the scientific evidence and against it. Each will be very well credentialed, and it'll be up to the jurors to make a decision whom they believe in. Ultimately, I believe they might come up, as you say, with more substantiating evidence. For example, after Kohberger was arrested, they then were able to take a cheek swab of his DNA. This DNA, I think, also matches the DNA that was found on a knife sheath that was left behind, and this is more than circumstantial. This should be a very key linchpin in getting a conviction.
Yeah, no, that's a really, really good point. I agree. And I saw that in the most recent hearing, there's now the argument on whether or not he gets to wear street clothes. So he showed up in street clothes, and Kaylee's father in particular was very upset about this. And gosh, I get it. I really can't imagine, Howard. I really can't. But then, I'm also thinking about this from another perspective. Well, is it fair that he shows up? I mean, I guess fair and constitutional that he shows up in shackles and in his prison garb. I don't know, and it's such a tough thing, right? It's so hard.
Well, at this point, he's innocent until he's proven guilty. You have to, give Kaylee's father. I cut him a lot of slack. He's a man who went out to the press and said, you send your daughter off to college and she comes back to you in a box.
Oh,
I mean,
God.
You send your kid off to college and she comes back to you in a box. You have to excuse him anything, he says. You have to excuse wherever his mind is. He's not always thinking reasonably at times.
Of course.
In trial after trial, suspects have had the right to come in their street clothes. You don't want to give any grounds for an appeal. This trial will be lasting 3 months. Let him come in his street clothes. What is most interesting about Kohberger now in his street clothes is he seems to be almost preening as he goes into the court. His most recent photo that he's given when he was transferred to the new jail, he's wearing sort of a hipster 3-day growth of beard. He has his hair pomaded. He seems to he's looking good, and he seems to be enjoying the attention. I mean, this must be a torture to the parents of the victims, but at the same time, he has the legal right to do this.
Yeah, you're right. And I agree. I cannot imagine being Kaylee's father. I probably would be saying worse than he's saying. I'm not kidding. It's also interesting. I mean, what's come up a lot is the fact that there really doesn't seem to be a motive right now for Kohberger either. And as you know, you don't necessarily have to have a motive, but that would be helpful. But in my opinion, I just take one look into his eyes, and I feel like that's the motive right there. He looks like a sociopath to me. He seems like a sociopath. And although there's no history of him committing any violent acts in the past, it seems like he just killed to kill, in my opinion.
Well, I think the motive, as I've been able to put the pieces together, will be defined at the trial, is that he set out not to kill 4 students, but just to kill one. That night when he entered the house from the second floor open kitchen sliding door, he goes up immediately from the second floor to the 3rd floor bedroom of Maddie Mogan. I believe that she was his target. He had met her, I believe, when she was a waitress at the Mad Greek restaurant in downtown Moscow, where he would go because he liked the vegetarian food there. And there's no record of his ever having spoken with her. There's no record of his ever following her on social media, but I believe there was something about her exuberance, her beauty, her blondness that caused him to be fixated on her. And he would then go by the house where parties were taking place. He'd be on the outside looking in. He saw her exuberance, her vitality as a rebuke to the outsider's life he was leading. And in the course of several months of watching this, observing this, he came to the realization that he could never be a part of this world. And if he couldn't be a part of this world, he wanted to exorcise it from the world he was living in. So he went off to kill her. As it happened, that night in her bedroom, she was sharing it with another one of the young girls, and his whole plan went out the window. He now had to kill two people. As he goes down the stairs, he's made all this noise. Ethan Chapin, who's been staying with his girlfriend, comes out. Ethan is 6'4", a wonderful young man. Kohberger, or the assailant rather, has no choice but to kill him, one slash to the jugular. Then Ethan's girlfriend approaches. She says something, there's someone here. The suspect says, I won't hurt you. But of course, he immediately proceeds to kill her. And these three other people were just collateral damage. After these 4 murders of these young people, something happens that's extremely perplexing. One of the other young women on the second floor comes out of her bedroom, and she sees the assailant all dressed in black. He has the knife in his hand at this point. And what does she do? She says nothing. She's locked in a state of fear. She can't talk. As for the assailant, I believe he's locked in his own armory of hate. He's surrounded by his own mania. If he had noticed her, if she had screamed, if she had said anything, I believe she too would have been killed. But it's her silence that allows him to walk out of the house and her to go back to her own room. What happens after she goes back to her own room is another one of the mysteries of this case. It's not until 8 hours later, 8 hours, that she finally calls someone. And when she makes the call, she doesn't call the police. She calls friends at a nearby fraternity house. They come over at 11 o'clock the next morning, and they finally call the police, who then respond to the murder scene.
Yeah, that is incredibly perplexing. And Howard, I felt like I was having you read your book to me. That was such a special moment, as tough as that was to hear. But Howard Blum, I have to go. My time is up with you, but I really appreciate you coming on to the Outlier podcast and discussing this. I would encourage everybody to get the book When the Night Comes Falling. I'm enjoying it so far, and I'm learning a lot. So I appreciate you.
Great. Nice speaking with you.
Thank you, Howard. And that was author and investigative journalist Howard Blum. Go and read his book if you haven't already, When the Night Comes Falling. He does an incredible job with that book, and I love talking to him. He was truly very, very interesting. So, thank you so much for tuning into The Outlier. Make sure to subscribe wherever you listen, leave us a review, and if you want to stay informed about all of the major crime and pop culture stories, make sure you follow me everywhere on X at Conlin_Lauren, on Instagram at Lauren Emily Conlin, or visit my website, popcrime.tv, and also my YouTube channel at Popcrime TV or at Primetime Crime Show. I'm Lauren Conlin, and we'll see you next time.